first speaker this morning, ladies and gentlemen, is a Nobel Prize-winning economist, someone who minces no words. His severe criticism of the IMF and cryptocurrency is well known, but it's his disagreement with Donald Trump's trade and foreign policy that we focus on today. His book, Globalization and Its Discontents, is considered a Bible to understand global trade and its dynamics. He unveiled an updated version of this last year to fit in a post-Trump era. So, how will Trump's policies reshape the global world order? What should India do to thrive and grow in this insular world? Let's hear it up for Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz on anti-globalization in the era of Trump.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here, although the subject itself is one that is a little bit uncomfortable. I've just come back from a trip which has involved several days in China, talking to their economic leaders, a brief stop in Japan, and now coming to India. And it's very clear that Trump has upset the normal way that people are thinking about trade and diplomacy. What I want to talk to you today about, this morning about, is the looming trade war that Trump promised when he ran for the presidency. It took him a year to deliver it, but it seems to be on the offing. He has announced tariffs of 25% on steel, 10% on aluminum, and much further tariffs up to $60 billion worth on Chinese goods in response to what he calls stealing of intellectual property. What I want to do this morning is just talk about 5 important points to think about as one thinks about this looming trade war. The first is that while Trump has exploited and exacerbated the problems in globalization, they were essentially, these problems would have come to the fore anyway. In other words, he's brought them forward, he's heightened them, but one has to understand that there are some underlying fundamental problems that needed to have been addressed. He doesn't understand them, but he's very good at intuitively exploiting these discontents. The first is that globalization, in the manner that it was managed by the United States, has had enormous distributive consequences on a majority of citizens in the United States. I'll just give you a little bit of data. I have a few minutes here, but a couple of striking things. Life expectancy in the United States as a whole is decreasing. And the life expectancy of white men particularly, say, who are not college graduates, is decreasing very, very rapidly. The only time I've seen any data like this was at the time of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, when there was a societal breakdown. So it is a hint that something very severe is going on. And when you look dig deeper into the data, you see what is some of these. The median income of a full-time male worker, and the ones who have a full-time job are the lucky ones. The median income of a full-time male worker is at the same level that it was 42 years ago. I mean, can you imagine? More than 40 years of stagnation for the people in the middle. no hope. At the bottom, real wages, that is wages adjusted for inflation, are the same as they were 60 years ago. So it's like in the whole history of India since independence, there would have been no economic change. So the result of this is despair. And when I said life expectancy is down, a major part of this is what we call deaths of despair. The increase in suicide, alcoholism, drug overdose, social diseases. There's no physical disease. We've really done enormously well in conquering physical diseases, but these social diseases are overwhelming and reflect something that is deep and going on. There are many forces associated with this, including changes in technology, but globalization is one, an important one, and one that people feel they can and should do something about. So you can't stop the force of technological change, but globalization is a result of what we, our governments, do. What has really been going on is hinted at by how particularly the conservatives, the Republicans, have responded to these problems. When globalization began, when we started signing trade agreements, the Democrats said there ought to be trade adjustment assistance for those who were losing their jobs. But the Republicans said no, and there was only a limited amount of assistance. You might say, why was that? Well, there's another little piece that gives a hint. We've signed in many of our trade agreements, like in NAFTA, provisions called investment agreements that have the effect of giving more secure property rights for American firms that invest abroad than they have at home. So at home, if there's a change in regulation, there's no compensation. If an American firm invests abroad and that firm and the foreign government changes a rule saying, well, I'm worried about climate change and you can't pollute, under these agreements, the firm can sue the government and be compensated in a private arbitration panel that is stacked for the private sector. So the result of this is that there is more secure property rights abroad than at home. So you might say, one of the big advantages of the United States was it had a good legal system and protection of property. Why would a country give away that competitive advantage? And the answer is simple. It was the corporations who wanted to drive down wages, to get lower wages, not just abroad, which they could do by moving their factories abroad, but also at home. Because they could tell their workers, if you don't accept a lower wage, we'll move abroad, we can bring the goods in, and we are protected, our property rights are protected. So there is at least one interpretation that one of the main objectives of the trade agreements was to weaken the bargaining power of workers and to lower the wages. So these distribution effects, which were predicted, were not an collateral damage. They were actually part of the main show. The second reason why there are some fundamental problems has to do with America is just waking up to the national security issue that the growth of China presents. 25 years ago, China was a small, poor country. It has grown faster than anybody could have anticipated. So now, in purchasing power parity, the usual way economists compare countries, China is larger than the United States. And because China has 5 times the population and is growing so rapidly, within a moderate period of time, 10, 15 years, China will be twice as large as the United States. So the global power balance is fundamentally being changed. Even more disturbing is the fact that in some of the critical technologies, China is moved comparable or faster than the United States. In solar, China advanced the solar technology faster than the United States. But most disturbing is AI, artificial intelligence, which is one of the most important technologies going forward. And there it appears that China is doing work comparable to the United States, but because it has access to more data, because they have less privacy concerns, in fact, they like intrusion, and big data is what makes artificial intelligence work, China will have an advantage over the United States. And this, of course, is very worrisome to the United States. And that brings me to the third basic point. There are fundamental differences in our economic systems. And when the trade agreements were signed, the implications of these fundamental differences were not fully grasped. Let me give an example in a different context. The US and the EU have been fighting for years over Airbus versus Boeing. The United States effectively subsidizes Boeing through our defense system. It gives money to Boeing to develop a plane, and then that plane is converted very easily into a commercial plane. Europe says that's unfair. Europe doesn't do that. It gives direct subsidies. US says that's unfair. So you have two different systems. They're both subsidizing airplanes, but they're two different ways of doing it, and each says the other is unfair. Now, what we have to recognize is that there are these fundamental differences in economic systems, which mean that there are going to be natural competitive advantages that arise out of the system. And most important is the one I just mentioned, AI. And what's particularly probably ought to be disturbing in the United States is that the United States does not have a central way of allocating research resources where China does. So in the US, we've had a lot of innovation, but you ask what the innovation has been about. It's creating social media, it's creating all kinds of things that are important for us to connect with each other. But it is not doing things that show up in our macroeconomic data. And in fact, Bob Gordon has been arguing that overall, our growth rate is slowing down. Whereas China controls its R&D budget and can control it in ways that will give it a competitive advantage over the long run. So this is obviously deeply disturbing. To put it in another way, China and the US both have industrial policies, but they run their industrial policies differently. US has an industrial policy to encourage the financial sector. We encourage the financial sector through provisions in our bankruptcy law, through helping the banks in the 2008-2009 crisis. And China has its own industrial policy run very differently. And that means there's inevitably going to be tension about we claiming they are subsidizing, they claim we are subsidizing. And there is no easy way of resolving these differences. I only have about 8 minutes more, so let me go very quickly through the other points I want to make. The second point I wanted to make is that Trump's response of protection is wrong. What he's mostly interested is doing is grandstanding. He's not really interested in solving the problems of middle-income Americans. In fact, a lot of what is going on is while they're complaining about trade barriers, problems in trade with China, a lot of the negotiations are about opening up Chinese markets to Wall Street firms. Those two have nothing to do with each other. But Wall Street wants more opening. They don't really care. The Trump administration really doesn't care about the middle-income Americans that support him, what effect that will have. Um, in fact, his policies, which will have the effect of destroying global supply chains, will actually hurt those in the Midwest. The increasing steel prices will hurt our car sales. And you could go down the line. Poor Americans are very dependent on cheap clothes imported by Walmart from China. So Trump's policies, trade policies, will really hurt those very people who he says he is concerned about. Moreover, Trump will not get the response that he hoped for. Appeasement never works. And China is not going to act in a way that appeases Trump. And they made that very clear. They've already said that they're going to increase in response to the tariffs on steel. They're going to impose $3 billion of tariffs. And they've said if Trump accelerates, they will match whatever he does. And they will target these for those places in America where it hurts, and particularly where it hurts politically. Moreover, the way Trump focuses his discussion undermines his credibility. No economist talks about bilateral trade deficits. No economist differentiates between trade deficits, trade in goods, and trade in services. This is something I'm particularly sensitive about because Columbia University, our universities, are massive exporters of services. But he says services don't count. We think they do. So the point I want to make is that in a sense, the focus on bilateral trade deficit is meaningless. And you see the kind of dilemma that he gets in. We have a deficit with Mexico, but we have a surplus with Canada. So you say, are we unfair to Canada? His answer is yes. You have a surplus, but that's because you're including services. You have a deficit in goods, so Canada is also unfair. Everybody is unfair in his view. But there's an easy way of solving the bilateral trade deficit with China, which would have no effect on anything, on anybody, which would be China would agree to buy, say, American oil, and then sell that oil to other countries. So its only change would be it would its role as a middle person. And yet, the recorded bilateral trade deficit would change. I said appeasement won't work, and I don't think most big countries will do that. Korea has given in to the United States, and it has appeased the United States in a way that would be unacceptable to any country with dignity. They decided that as part of the agreement, they will accept 50,000 unsafe American cars. Now, how can you say you have a safety standard and American cars don't meet the safety standard, and so you're going to allow on your streets cars that you believe do not meet those safety standards? It seems to me that that's unconscionable. But there's another thing that is deeply disturbing to central bankers. The agreement had a side agreement about how the conduct of monetary policy. I don't think central bankers, and I already talk to some, are going to find that acceptable. The third point I want to make is this is not, so far, a trade war. It's a skirmish. Very few dollars, but a lot of principles are at stake. Could it escalate? Probably not, because U.S. laws do not delegate to the president the powers to escalate a trade war. In other words, the powers that are given to the president in trade policy are very limited. In particular, he cannot withdraw from the WTO without a vote of both houses of Congress. The only conditions that he can impose a tariff is under a limited number of conditions, like we call them safeguards, dumping, countervailing duties, and in each of those, there has to be a long process where you evaluate whether there is a case. So a trade war where your hands are tied like that is not a real war. So I don't think we are going to see an escalation into a trade war. The fourth point I want to make is it should be clear from what I've already said that what we need is a rethinking of the global architecture of trade. We'll have to have, I think, new standards of how we judge what a subsidy is, what we mean by currency manipulation. When the U.S. lowered the interest rate in 2008 in response to our crisis, the main way that it had an effect on our economy was through a change in the exchange rate. Was this currency manipulation? I think the general consensus is no. It was done for reasonable domestic concerns. When Korea has high safety standards for their cars, is that to exclude American cars? No. They don't want people to die in their cars, and that seems to me reasonable. So in each of these cases, I think we have to move from a standard where we recognize there are differences in economic systems, differences in values and concerns, and we have to have what I would call a reasonable standard. The final point is, what happens if the U.S. refuses to go along with WTO? Let me say that a lot of people don't realize the threat that Trump is already making to the WTO. He has blocked the appointment of judges to the point where sometime this year they will not be able to have a quorum in the courts. And they will not be able, therefore, to perform their absolute central role of adjudicating disputes. So the question is, where do we go from here? I think what would be desirable is to change the mindset of the U.S. and say you have to be part of a global rule of law. We cannot have a jungle. The rule of law is important internationally as it is domestically. But if the United States won't go along, I think the international community's response is we will have a WTO -1. We'll create an international rule of law in which you are the rogue state, just like they are doing in Paris. The U.S. withdrew from Paris, and what was the response to the rest of the world? We are committed. The rest of the world said, we are committed to Paris. And most of the U.S. said, we are committed to Paris. So one can't allow a single unhinged person who got less than a majority of votes in the United States destroy the global system that we've worked so hard to create. So I think it would be important for India to take a leadership with other emerging markets and say we and the advanced countries want and need a global rule of law. And that means sanctions against the U.S. when it violates this international rule of law. If it pollutes the world, if it doesn't adhere to certain standards in carbon emissions, there need to be cross-border taxes. So let me conclude with just 3 very brief remarks. I think, as I say, there are underlying problems. Trump has exacerbated them. He's a passing phenomena. He will go. But the effects of Trump are going to be long-standing. He has reminded everybody that borders do matter. We worked for 75 years to create a world in which borders mattered less. And now we know that borders do matter, and countries will have to focus on issues like food and energy security more than they did before. Secondly, there is a new geopolitics. it was inevitable that we would move to a multipolar system, increasing China, increasing India, and their standing in the global economy. The world in which one country dominated was a temporary phenomena. But, and it's clear that Trump hastened that transition. But inevitably, what Trump has done has undermined the standing of the U.S., and I think it's unfortunately going to take a long time to repair. The second long-standing effect is more American. He has destroyed, or is in the process of destroying, many of our institutions. You can read about it day by day, what he's doing to our State Department, what he's doing to our system of environmental protection, how he wants to undermine our systems of checks and balances, how he's criticizing the media, which is an important part of our system of checks and balances. I think there's a little bit of a silver lining in this particular cloud, which I get when I talk, for instance, to leaders in Europe. They said, he has helped us understand what we're for. By seeing what America is doing, we now know what are our values, what are we committed to, and it actually has strengthened the European Union because it has made them aware of the importance of what they are standing for. And I hope it does that and strengthens institutions in other countries around the world. And the final point deals with what you deal with every day as a media. It is our system of epistemology, what we mean by truth. You cannot have a functioning society where people have different views, alternative facts. We can have different interpretations. We can try to have different analyses, but you cannot have some people who have alternative facts. And so by, the major change in the West over the last 250 years that has resulted in an increasing standard of living by many-fold is the Enlightenment. Are realizing the importance of rational inquiry, the scientific method that allows deliberation. He has attempted to destroy all that. And that, if he succeeded, would be the most devastating effect of what he does. Fortunately, there is a fight against this, and now we are understanding how dangerous. It's not just a politician of the ordinary kind, it's a political movement that attempts to destroy the foundations of our society. And by understanding the way in which it is undermining the foundations of our society, hopefully we can have a response that not only fights against it, but restores those foundations and strengthens them. Thank you.
The last I heard, Donald Trump thought Democrats were un-American. So from a Democrat comes the unhinged retort. That was a nice one, Professor Stiglitz. And we also thought Donald Trump relied heavily on artificial intelligence. So whether he takes a Democrat seriously or not, he should consider the views of a renowned economist and a Nobel laureate.